For those of you who are joining us now, welcome. My name is Andre Marcu. I'm the director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. This is the launch event for our paper, Carbon Leakage Risks for CBAM Goods for Export, covers for the sectors covered by CBAM. So we are, the panelists are more or less here. I think Heiko Kunst is missing from DG Klima, but I'm sure he will emerge. And we'll wait for a few minutes while people are streaming in. There's apparently a substantial number of people, but as in every Brussels meeting, that is to be taken with a grain of salt. So we'll wait for people to sign in, and then we will start. Hi, Heiko. Well, I see that Heiko now has joined us, and he's connecting, hopefully. Yeah, Heiko, can you hear us?
Yeah, I do. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So all our speakers are here today. Now, again, we will wait for 2-3 minutes for people to sign in. It takes a bit of time, I guess, for everybody to stream in and for me to speak while they do that, so to keep you busy. Now, what I will say, a couple of things. First of all, for those of you that continue to sign in and stream in, this is the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, and we are launching our paper on the carbon leakage risk for CBAM covered sectors in the ETS. This is an online event. It is not under Chatham House rules, so it's an open event. It is running between 3 and 5 o'clock p.m. We're starting now. And the structure of the presentation is going to be, the session will be first a welcome and presentation of the paper. And I have to say that the agenda is deficient because it mentions, and besides myself, Michael and Aaron Cosby, but it does not mention Sarah Svensson, who has been working quite hard to make this paper happen and is the author of quite a bit of the work in there. And then we will get a reaction from a panel. It's an initial panel by Heiko Kunst from DG Klima, Adina Georgescu from Eurometaux, Domine van Genechten now with E3G, Marc Poulin with AFED, the Association of French large companies, private-owned large companies. And then last but not least, Claudia Gibis from the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action of Germany. Now, I'm looking at numbers, and numbers continue to go up. For some reason, I think that I'm speaking too fast. But I think also we should maybe start getting on with this, Sarah, and we should start with our presentation. So will you share the screen with us so we can go through the presentation? We will try to keep the presentation to about 20 minutes. This is a webinar. After we finish our presentation and we get the reactions from the panelists, obviously, this is open to everybody. We encourage people to raise their little electronic hands, and then we will promote them to be a panelist as opposed to a participant. And very much encourage people to critique, not necessarily criticize, but critique the paper. And if necessary, criticize the paper. It is something that we put quite a bit of work, frankly, a little bit more than we had initially anticipated. But this is the case for many things that you start, sometimes you don't know exactly how much it's going to take. Again, the credits should include Sarah, and it's not, so we should do better in this, Sarah, in the future. Now, can we go to the first slide, please? So first of all, what I just say, you all know that as a part of the ETS review, says by December 2024, as part of annual report to the Parliament and the Council, the Commission has assessed the risk of carbon leakage for goods subject to CBAM. and produced in the EU Union for exports to countries which do not apply the EU ETS or a similar carbon pricing. So the report shall assess in particular the carbon leakage in sector to which carbon will apply. Now, this is something that is very welcome. It may be a little bit early, at least in our view, because there will be not a lot of experience. But it also required that where appropriate, just to with the legislative proposal to address carbon neutral risk in a manner that's complying the rule of WTO. So this is a two-part in a way to do an assessment and, if necessary, produce submit a proposal. In our case, what we did is, for a variety of reasons, we also took a two-step approach. So the first step is the report that you see today, and this report is going to focus on the importance and the need of addressing the export issue in the CBAM. That is a conscious decision. And then there's a second part. The second part is the proposal. So, it's very interesting. Yes, we will share our views or whether this is important, that this is important, why this is important. But at the same time, we are also consciously not including the second part, a proposal, because we feel that putting a proposal at this time, which is in April, which is in the middle of a political cycle, people focusing on elections, people focusing on a lot of other things, and with the new composition of institutions, elections and so on, we feel that the second part we will put it forward sometime in the fall. We remind people that we have made the proposal when the debate was taking place, and that we will repolish and revisit, but we will not put anything out as a proposal now. It will come out in the fall. So next, Sarah, you take it from here, and then it's Sarah, Michael, and Aaron, and Andre at the end. So Sarah, you go ahead, please.
Yes, so to look at how important exports are for the EU, we looked at 4 of the sectors covered by CBAM that have a significant proportion of exports. And we didn't only look at the proportion or the percentage of the EU production that they do export, but also each sector has their own particular circumstances that do also make exports extra significant for the business model. So if we start at looking to fertilizers, exports account for approximately 16% of the EU production, but some plants export as much as 60% of their production to outside of the EU. And the seasonal demand of fertilizers requires them to also export to markets which have different seasons than the EU does, so that they can function at optimal capacity levels, and also they can't store all that to only supply for the EU market. Some of the major export destinations include Brazil, the UK, Ukraine, and the USA and China. And if you look at this figure, you can see that the average emission intensity of fertilizer products produced in the EU are among the lower ones of the countries included in this graph, and compared to their competitors around the world. If we go on to look at cement, around 6% of the EU production is exported, but there are very large variations between different countries. So countries that are closer to the EU border or have large ports tend to have a higher percentage, where countries such as Greece and Ireland export as much as 40% of their production to outside of the EU. For the cement sector, also carbon costs constitute a significant proportion of their production costs. And some of the major export destinations are the UK, the US, Bosnia, Serbia, and Montenegro. And if we look at here, I don't know what happened to this graph, but it's also among the lower carbon intensities of cement production if you compare to these countries that are included in the JRC emission intensity report that the EU competes with. If we go on to look at iron and steel, exports represent around 18% of the EU production. And it's also has a cyclical demand. So to be able to reach the demand in the EU market, when it's high, we need to have the right capacity. But since a lot of the steel production has high fixed costs and has to export its capacity when demand in the EU is low, it's also sensitive to losing these exports if it wants to produce at an optimal capacity level. Some of the main destinations we've also included here, the UK, the US, Turkey, Mexico, China, Canada. And it's also here in this graph has among the lower emission intensities. And the same goes for aluminium, which has around 20% of its production exported and also has a lower emission intensity, average emission intensity compared to a lot of its export destinations or major competitors. So there I will leave it over to Michael to go through some of the other challenges that we're seeing.
Sarah, do you still want to speak to the history of CBAM? Yeah.
Yes. So just briefly on the history of the exports, including or not including the exports in the CBAM. When the CBAM was first presented by Ursula von der Leyen, there was no mention of exports, but as the process went on, there was industry emphasized the importance of an export solution to maintain competitiveness and mitigate adverse effects on EU producers, while some NGOs expressed concerns about the potential impact on global climate ambition. And there was also a large discussion about the WTO compatibility. While the Commission proposal did not initially address this issue, the EU Parliament position going into trilogues did include a suggestion for a solution of exports, and the Council position included a suggestion for a review of the export issue in 2026. However, in the final legislation that we have now, the Commission has to review the CBAM and its impact on carbon leakage concerning exports in a review before January 2028.
Yeah,
Now,
Michael, before you take it away, I mean, this was one of the hard fought, if you want to quote unquote hard fought items. This is by no means the only one. And it's not to be seen, the fact that we're emphasizing and we are responding to this review is not to mean that this is the only issue that is left or that's important in the CBAM. That is to be quite clear, but this is something that I think per total, most of the argument against it has really kind of stayed in the end on the legality and the WTO compliant. At least that is my perception, that in the end it came from the legal part of the from legal services, I understood, and that the question of whether this would be WTO compliant was an issue. Michael, you take it away from here now. Look at the changing landscape.
Thanks, and thanks, Sarah. So yeah, chapter 3 of the report looks at the broader context. It does not look, that's what Aaron will follow after me, looking at the impact of phasing out free allocation and introducing CBAM specifically for exports. But chapter 3 focuses on the broader context. And I noticed at the end of last week, pretty, I think, impactful piece of news that ThyssenKrupp is shutting down operations in Duisburg, the largest steelmaking location in Europe, and citing sort of challenging market conditions. That's something we've heard many, many times in the last couple of years from various sectors that are now squarely relevant, the ones that Sarah just described for the export issue and a producer of CBAM covered goods. And so what exactly does, what does that add up to? What exactly are they referring to? So our argument in the report in chapter 3 is that since 2020 and 2021, when the inception impact assessment was carried out, then the full impact assessment looking at different design options for the CBAM. And then finally, we have, of course, then the proposal in July 2021 that does not include a solution for export-related leakage for products exported from the EU into global markets. These broader parameters of economic activity of operating in global markets have changed quite dramatically across the world. And some of the developments, not limited to, but probably the main ones are, in particular, the increase in various raw materials, but especially energy costs that are faced by European producers relative to foreign competitors. Energy costs have increased also in other parts of the world, but the increase, relatively speaking, is much more dramatic in Europe. They have stabilized and declined again, but still remain significantly higher on the order of 2 to 3 times higher than in many competitors, including not just China, for instance, but also the United States. A continued growth in foreign production capacities in many sectors. China is, of course, an important actor in this regard, but also other emerging economies in Southeast Asia and Latin America, etc. And often behind that is Chinese outward investments. And in some sectors like steel, there's of course more than a decade of well-documented tremendous excess production capacity. So more production capacity than actual production and demand, which results in suboptimal capacity utilization. And this, of course, affects producers around the world, but it just adds to sort of the constraints or pressures facing European producers. And in some sectors, again, steel is a good example, but others like aluminum are also affected. A lot of interventions, market interventions, aggressive industrial policy. Of course, we're familiar with that in Asian economies, especially China. That's been the case for a long time. We did not quote in the report data because it's hard to find recent data, but the OECD, for instance, went all the way to 2019 with its latest data, suggesting that between 3 to 9 times the state support in the form of R&D subsidies, tax credits, grants, and concessional loans that Chinese producers of these commodities receive compared to European producers. But of course, we also know that the US has ramped up industrial policy and supports with various acts of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And while the EU is sort of following suit, it's yet to be seen how effective, how well it can mobilize the necessary resources, and how well it can counter the moves of other jurisdictions, of other trade partners competing in these global markets. And we see, of course, also an increase in trade defense measures and trade policy tactics, tariffs, etc., against imports from these countries. We also see a move to mandate increased onshoring of production of various of these commodities, critical commodities, energy, etc. The argument here is that for producers of CBAM covered goods that are trying to compete in global markets, this adds to sort of the pressures that they're dealing with. And it's pretty safe to say that, while in the long term, we may succeed with onshoring production capacities of, for instance, input materials and energy, we may be able to reduce the cost of energy once we have fully transitioned to renewable energy. In the medium and in the short and medium term, all of these factors will remain really serious constraints or really serious competitive disadvantages for European producers. And it would be foolish to assume that, for instance, the geopolitical tensions or the costs of natural gas or electricity will dramatically decline in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years when this issue becomes particularly relevant. And let me give a few examples in the form of charts to illustrate some of these developments. So let's go to the next slide, please. First, steelmaking capacity is very clear that all the growth in steelmaking capacity has occurred outside the EU and outside the OECD, mostly in China and Southeast Asian nations. Since the economic and financial crisis a bit over a decade ago, we see this dramatic growth also in excess capacity, which has remained quite persistent. And in the last couple of years, also flagging demand. So declining capacity utilization rates, all of which put pressure on the operating margins of producers. Next slide. On the energy costs, including electricity, but also natural gas, which is not only a source of energy, but also, of course, a feedstock for certain industries like fertilizers, we can also see very clearly. So the orange bar is the EU, but most of the ones all of the ones to the right of that are also European member states. So the costs of these on average are 2 to 3 times higher than competing nations like the US, Canada, Mexico, China, etc. And again, it's hard to imagine this will change dramatically in the short term. And let's look at the next and final slide with a graph, two I have. Nitrogenous fertilizers, we can see these challenging marketing conditions, again, of course, reflecting the particularly stark increase in natural gas prices in 2022 that has stabilized somewhat, but nonetheless, you can see how these very quickly manifest themselves in a change in relative, exports and imports by European producers. So imports have increased quite significantly, whereas exports have declined precipitously for nitrogenous fertilizers, 4-digit code HS code 3102, which depend very much on or are dependent on natural gases and inputs for producing hydrogen and ammonia. Next slide is cement and clinker, HS 4-digit code 2523, where also we've seen a steady increase in imports accompanied by a steady decline in exports. And again, sort of the takeaway message here is that everything else being equal, not even thinking about the CBAM now introducing the phase out of free allocation without protecting exports, conditions are challenging. And it's unlikely that many of these factors will dramatically ameliorate or alleviate in the next 3, 4, 5 years when the CBAM starts kicking in and really increasing also the carbon costs, which is what Aaron will talk about. A quick remark also about the timing. Next slide, please. Namely, the urgency of providing a signal that there will be some sort of policy solution here is that, of course, within about a decade already, just the decline of the overall supply of allowances, the cap under the EU ETS, without even thinking about the CBAM phasing out free allocation, is already more or less signaling that incumbent production processes in all these sectors, more or less, will become increasingly non-viable. So a very significant investment wave, a new cycle of investment has to occur to replace the existing stock of production assets with very different transformed ultra-low carbon production assets in the short to medium term. And whether or not we can provide a signal for producers that their competitiveness will be protected also in global markets, being important for the reasons that Sarah already described in the previous slides, will have an influence, will have an effect on where those investments are channeled, whether they occur in Europe or elsewhere. And at least in the last 2 years, a lot of the investment decisions that we have seen and heard about give rise to concern or reason to believe that currently that's going in the wrong direction. So providing a signal that in the near term and not in 2028 or beyond, but very soon, that there can be a policy solution for export-related leakage is important. And there's other factors, political factors that play into this that increase the urgency. For instance, the tariff rate quotas that have been introduced that have an 8-year sort of span. At the latest, they will expire by the 30th of June of 2026 to protect steel producers of certain steel products. That just adds to the uncertainty and the pressures faced by European producers. But now we look at specifically CBAM and the effect of the carbon cost, increasing carbon cost on these producers. That's where I hand over to Aaron.
Aaron, go ahead. Aaron? Whoops. Whoops. I'm not sure what happened to Aaron. Aaron is not on the screen, Michael. So either we wait for Aaron for 30 seconds or not more, after which we toss a coin which one of the two of us does the next one. Sarah, maybe you want to try Aaron on the phone. You have to know, all of you, this has never happened. I mean, we've been doing this for 5 years, and it obviously had to happen at some point. The fact of the matter is Michael is somewhere in New York, I'm in Europe, and Michael and Aaron, instead of being in Western Canada, is actually in Geneva, which accounts for the fact that probably they have better internet in Western Canada than Geneva. I guess we're not getting an answer. Mike, do you want to take it from here, or shall we do it together? Let's see how we manage this together. I think we're both comfortable with this, but you start and I'll jump in. Okay?
Of course. So what Aaron has done in the calculations in chapter 4 of the report is essentially take a number of assumptions on, for instance, continued decarbonization of production across Europe, looking at historical trends, the expectation of carbon cost of the EUA cost going forward in the next years all the way to 2034. And then, of course, the important known policy development, which is the introduction of the CBAM and the published phase-out schedule of free allocation as the CBAM is introduced. So that's what we have, of course, very known, very certain percentages in the EU ETS directive. Yeah, Aaron is telling us his hotel internet, the complete hotel internet in Geneva, is not somewhere in the Far East or anywhere. It's in Geneva, but the internet is down there. So using the assumptions and the known phase in and phase out schedule of CBAM and free allocation, the calculations that he conducted with a lot of interactions also with both, sources of data, familiar or known sources of data, published sources, but also drawing on inputs from the various sectors, is to calculate what this incremental increase of carbon costs for exports will mean for the of carbon costs will mean. Aaron, there you are. Go ahead.
Aaron is back. Aaron,
Hi.
I think we will.
My apologies. My hotel Wi-Fi dropped off a cliff. I'm joining you from my phone. We'll see how stable that connection is.
We're playing for time. You know, Michael and I were playing for time, like in the 80th minute, and the ball is out. So we're finding all kinds of reasons why we should prolong the throw in. But go ahead. I mean, you know, I think Michael was just giving a general broad overview as to the approach, but maybe you wanna use your own words.
Sure.
Go ahead.
And I'm sure Michael already laid out the context, but the idea is Sarah and Andre have already laid the foundations for how important exports are to these sectors. And then Michael has given us an excellent overview of the difficulties these sectors face as a result of a multitude of factors. What I've done then is to try to isolate among those difficulties, try to quantify what the CBAM minus any sort of an export solution adds to those difficulties. So what specifically does it mean to these covered sectors to have an ETS price which is unaccompanied by any free allocation and instead replaced by a CBAM if they don't have export protection? And I've done this by looking at 2 specific products, and they are representative products, but there's a lot of caveats here. They do not tell us anything, they do not tell us anything definitive about the other products. The 2 products are cold rolled steel, and specific type of cold rolled steel of millimeters, 600 millimeters or more in coil factor. And from the fertilizer sector, calcium ammonium nitrate, which is a particular blend of fertilizer, again, a representative product. So what is the picture that, I'm sorry to present a bunch of numbers to you, but what is the picture that these numbers are painting? What we've tried to do here is to forecast out to 2034 what these sectors will be facing given a number of changing factors. And of course, one of those changing factors is the fact that free allocation as a result of the CBAM factor ramps down to 0 as of 2034. You can see that in the second column. We've also tried to forecast what the EUA price will be. I will get into how we made some of these assumptions after we've looked at both steel and fertilizer. For now, I'm just going to draw the big picture. So We've assumed an EUA price. We've assumed a falling GHG intensity as steel production improves in its efficiency over time. And that gives us a cost of carbon per ton of steel produced of this type of steel. All right, and you can see that in the cost of carbon column. We've then assumed a global price, and this is the average of the last 10 years of price for this particular kind of a product. We've assumed that in 2023 doesn't change over time. This allows us then to calculate how much the abandonment of free allocation without an export solution is adding to the cost of producing these goods relative to the world price. In other words, how much is the premium over world price increasing if we ramp up the carbon cost without free allocation? Okay, and remember, these are globally traded goods. The European Union is not price setters in these goods. They are more or less price takers. So if you ramp up those costs, it's significant. If you ramp them up at all, these are highly traded goods. What we've done here is we've assumed what the production costs are. We don't have that data. That's not public data. So we've assumed that in 2024, the production costs plus the cost of carbon plus a 5% profit breaks us even at a global price of 700 euros a ton. As we go into the future, we hold those production costs the same. We hold the assumption of a normal 5% rate of profit the same. But of course, we're increasing the carbon cost. What happens? This picture shows that in the first 2 years, it's pretty minimal impact, but around 2030, it starts to be a more significant impact. So in fact, in 2030, we're looking at a premium over world prices of 18% if we assume that a normal 5% rate of profit, which is significant. As I said, these are globally traded products. So you raise the price that under which you can produce, you start losing markets. By 2034, we have a premium over world prices of 35% for this particular product. And in our estimation, that means you've completely lost your export markets. You cannot export, you cannot produce and export at a premium of that much. What does the picture look like for the next product? So if we go on to the next slide, if we're looking at the calcium ammonium nitrate, in the case of fertilizers, here we are, pretty much the same. Now this is we've done the same sorts of calculations here. If we look at the first few years, relatively smaller impact. By the time we get to 2030, it's a premium over global prices of 27%. By the time we get to 2034, a premium of almost 50%. Again, in our estimation, this means that in a globally competitive market for these products, you have lost your export market. You can still compete on the EU market because you have the protection of the CBAM, but in the global export markets where prices are not set by EU producers or by the EU producers plus CBAM, you have lost your capacity to compete. All right. If we could go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the assumptions that went on behind that. And normally it's bad to get into these kind of weeds in a nice presentation like this, but the assumptions are so critical that we need to at least look at them. We've assumed an ETS allowance price that increases over time. And this is a result we got from a study which went through 6 different modeling approaches and averaged them out. That's where we got those numbers. But of course, if the allowance price didn't go up by that much, then we would not have as big an impact. The world prices, as I say, for both of those products, we got from 10-year averages from the products involved. Improvements in GHG intensity of production. Now we assume that in the case of both iron, steel, and fertilizer, GHG intensity of production will fall over time as they get more efficient, as they invest in low carbon production. If that happens even more quickly than we assumed, then of course the impact will not be as great. Similarly, for cost of production, we've assumed that it doesn't remain changed. This is actually a conservative assumption because as they invest in low carbon technologies, they've probably, once you amortize the cost of those investments, you probably increased your cost of production. We've assumed that they will stay the same. The overarching message to take home from these assumptions is that while all of them matter, if you look in the report, we've done some minor sensitivity analysis. None of them matter so much that under reasonable assumptions about how much they might change, you get significantly different findings about the importance of the export markets for any of these products. So the take-home message then, if we can go to the next slide, The take-home message from that analysis, first, the caveats. This is an illustrative exercise only. There's a spectrum of legitimacy that runs from some scribbled notes on the back of a napkin in a bar to a full-blown CGE analysis and modeling. And we're somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but we believe we've done a reasonably good job of painting a picture. That picture shows that there will be major impacts and essentially a full loss of export markets for at least these two products, and we assume for many of the other covered products under CBAM by or before 2034. And that doesn't matter if we change some of these assumptions significantly, we still get the same kind of picture. That finding matters, given that we've noted the importance of the CBAM covered sectors to the ability to operate for some of these sectors. It's not just a loss of export markets. In some cases, you drop below capacity utilization at which it makes sense to operate at all. And given what we pointed out, or what Sarah pointed out, about the environmental preference of having things produced in the EU versus many of our trading partners. So from both an economic and environmental perspective, the loss of those export markets in line with what we predicted here matters a lot. I'll pass it over to Andre to wrap it up.
Yeah, look, I'll wrap it up, and I think that the conclusion that Aaron highlighted, that was highlighted, I think, throughout the report, is that exports are and will continue to be an important component of the economy, and especially the CBAM sectors. I think we mentioned that not all sectors will be impacted. It's in a similar way, and there will be differences from sector to sector, but also depending on geographical location and so on. The importance is both economical and environmental. I think it's been illustrated quite abundantly that in general, the carbon intensity of production in the EU seems to be better and better performant than what we see around the world. The fact that what Michael highlighted, the excess capacity that is being built, and we've seen incredible excess capacity over the last 10 years in steel, aluminum in China, you know, 600-700% increase, aggressive marketed, high energy prices in Europe, and those energy prices are also being illustrated by graphs. One can argue that they stabilize, but one can also argue this is a structural, cyclical, and will they actually come down? And I think some of us would conclude, especially what we've seen, you know, we've seen articles. I don't believe everything that I read in the press, but we've seen articles from credible, if you want, heads of very large energy enterprise in Europe that indicate that these prices cannot be expected to come down very quickly. So this is going to be an important. Now, the exports are an important component because you want to increase your market share like everybody does, but the commercial viability has been highlighted. 75-80% increase utilization factor is something that is being quoted in general as a threshold for making something economically viable, commercially viable. If you fall under that, and just a few percentage points in cement, in steel, or in fertilizer, or the other sectors will make a difference of the commercial viability. One thing that we said at the beginning, that carbon leakage, this analysis of carbon leakage risk for CBAM covered sectors on exports is to be treated as a normal part of the ETS market functioning. We don't think this is good enough. We admire very much that report. We read it, we produce our own report, and we're proud of it. For those who you want, we'll be issuing our new version in May. But nevertheless, having this such an important topic as being one chapter in that report, I think really does not do justice to the topic, does not just to topic justice to the importance that not only the stakeholders that are directly impacted, but I think the economy of Europe as per total will do. Next, please. Now, the fact that we have an investment cycle now which is driven by the need to the fact that most installations that we have in a number of sectors will become obsolete and not viable, and that will require a new cycle investment that requires a certain amount of urgency to find a way and deal with this, either do the analysis and have a proposal. Now, the other thing that we need to also understand that the issue of exports and the CBAM sectors will expand horizontally and vertical to additional sector and across value chains. That is something needs to be looked at. The fact that the review should also assess export-related leakage risk from product category in other sectors in downstream value chains to which CBAM may eventually be extended. This is important. Therefore, we would urge very much in terms of the general approach, because the Commission will start this review in due time. When it does, they probably have a cycle like everybody else. We have a cycle to produce our report. They have a cycle to producing their report. But we very much urge that we use a dynamic approach, not only looking backwards, but looking forward at the future trends. I think it has to have its own process. Again, cannot be totally amalgamated in a process, in a normal process. This is an important topic. We would urge that stakeholder consultation be held and that the findings be debated with stakeholders before finalizing them. This is important. We need to make sure, we do this. Everybody has their own processes. We would urge that if to the degree that this is possible and the governance that the Commission has, that this should be considered. Next, please. Now, and the last but not least thing, if this is now covering certain sectors, and it's important. I mean, certain people have asked me, why do we need to produce steel in Europe? I think if we have that kind of conversation, I think it's very difficult to reach the conclusion, and I don't think anybody seriously will pose that question. But as we expand the coverage of CBAM and as we expand the coverage of ETS, we have now ETS 1, we have ETS 2. We as ERCSD also are looking at the coverage of agriculture under ETS or the ETS 3 or whatever ETS it is. But a new ETS, new sector is unlikely to go to free allocation. I mean, it sounds a little bit counterintuitive that you eliminate free allocation everywhere you start with free allocation. So imagine CBAM on agriculture. Imagine that, and introducing that, how politically sensitive, this is politically sensitive. Imagine how politically sensitive is agriculture for Brazil, for South Africa, for Africa in general, how dynamic and how politically complicated this is going to become. So in light of all this, really, we hope that there will be even consideration to the fact that there is a special process that really there's a spotlight on this process, and that it's not subsumed completely in this report. The second part of what we will do, which is I mentioned at the beginning, which will be the proposal. The proposal will come in the fall when we all come back from La Rentrée and we have the opportunity to start the discussions again. With this, I'll stop here. So Sarah, if you want to bring us back. Now, Heiko, I hope that you find this constructive. It is meant to be constructive. I think our team and ERCSD has tried to always be constructive, worked closely and in a very cooperative way with both your colleagues and you at DG Klima, but also with our colleagues at DG Taxud. And we very much appreciated the cooperation we received. So you have the floor first.
Yes, sir. Many thanks, Andre, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, indeed, this is a very constructive, and this is also very, very interesting. And I think also this paper, we've seen now is also a very interesting contribution to the related discussions. Maybe let me start with one point up front, which is more general about the legislative framework we have in place. Yes, it is true that there is no free location for the exports. There is no carbon leakage protection via free location for exports. But we also need to see what is going to happen with the allowances we do not give out for free due to the phase-in of CBAM. They do not disappear. Half of them go to the Innovation Fund, and Innovation Fund money is straight going to industry. It's industry support. The other half is going to member states, to the benefit of member state, with a clear encouragement to use it also to support exporting industries. So we can see that the phase out of free location is not leading necessarily to less support to industry. And I think it's very important that we do have already now 2 measures in place to address the export issue. And maybe also the moment to manage expectations. I mean, President von der Leyen announced CBAM, I think it was very late in 2019. And obviously since then we discuss the export issue. Many highly intelligent people thought about how to bring free location and CBAM together and to make it WTO compatible. And so far, no one found the great solution which can bring all these things together after many years of reflections of highly intelligent people. So I think there is no easy solution for that. I recall clearly when we negotiated both CBAM and ETS together in December, it was 1.5 years ago. This has been one of the main issues and the remaining points for the very end of the negotiations. And that's the outcome. Half of the allowances go to the Innovation Fund, and the revenues from the other half going to member states with the encouragement to use it to support these sectors. Let me now go to some points. I would like to make some remarks on this very interesting paper. Maybe starting with I think it's also in the first part on the statistics. Yes, we see different export shares for these sectors we looked at, and also of course the development over time, which indeed goes into a certain direction. And it is that's where I fully agree. It is something which was not really known when CBAM and ETS have been proposed, and even not fully known when they have been adopted. I mean, what we've seen is a really dramatic development in the gas prices for obvious political reasons. And that is, of course, something the policy decisions could not incorporate and address. Of course, when looking at the exports, it's also very important to distinguish. I mean, fortunately, some of the trading partners concerned do have carbon pricing. I mean, I noted that countries like the United Kingdom or Switzerland are among the most important countries we export to for these energy-intensive sectors. But there are also a number of countries in the neighborhood which are EU candidates and which will introduce carbon pricing in the not-too-distant future. We are talking to them as we speak, in the Western Balkans in particular. That is one point which, of course, needs to be taken into consideration. Those who already do carbon pricing, very similar or even almost identical to what we do. I mean, we know Switzerland is linked to our ETS, and UK, maybe the carbon price is no longer identical, but the philosophy of their ETS is ours. And I mean, when I'm looking, I've been involved in the development of the product benchmarks. It's almost an IPR issue. They use our definitions, our concepts, which is very good. So that's something where we have already equivalent measures in place. And when we look a bit broader or outside these European countries, I think That's something also we need to take into account for our future-looking, forward-looking analysis. CBAM just started with its test phase, you can call it. So there at impacts at EU level, we can't say it. We don't know it today. But what we do know today, what we can observe is the significantly and really significantly growing global interest in carbon pricing. It is, that's not necessarily mainly for my team, but for other colleagues in DG Klima, we are flooded by requests to help others to set up carbon pricing systems. And I think that is a very encouraging impact of CBAM. And of course, this would also need to be considered for our analysis. Of course, some of them only start now, others are already in the phase of introducing it, and they need to strengthen their existing systems or to expand it, but the development goes in a very, very good direction. Well, another point maybe also important for the analysis, and that's where it really becomes extremely tricky, is I mean, carbon leakage risks are not or can't really be considered in isolation, in particular if you want to correlate it with trade developments. I mean, there are other factors, and I mentioned one before. The gas price development had extremely severe impacts on the fertilizer sectors, for example. I think for them, carbon pricing is not a primary concern. The primary concern is tripled gas price, which is not only an energy carrier, but also their raw material they are using. And this, of course, has significant impacts on their market position in the EU, but also, of course, for exports. Very hard, I think, to distinguish then how many percentage of a trade development is linked to the energy prices and what's the share where carbon pricing is the main driver. What else do we have? Yes, maybe one important element which also requires to be further addressed. I mean, there are very good considerations in the paper, for example, on the impact of capacity utilization, which basically makes a link between the internal market and export market. I think that's a very interesting topic. Yes, you can't really decouple. If you lose exports, then even your domestic production might be, or your domestic sales might be at risk, because the overall cost structure, it doesn't enable you to produce at competitive prices. But similarly, I think we also need to look at the implications of CBAM, that we price now the imports coming in our market. And as we've seen in the paper, and that's also, of course, what we heard before, is that as a tendency, the non-European producers are more carbon intensive. And that, of course, means that at the EU market, CBAM makes them less competitive than the EU producers having less emissions they have to pay for. And of course, this benefit of CBAM could also have, with the same logic that exports and domestic production are coupled, it can also have a positive impact on the CBAM sectors, that their higher competitiveness at the EU market could also allow them to cross-subsidize exports to some extent. I think that's an element which also merits to be looked at. One additional point I noted, yes, assumptions on the development of the emission intensity, very difficult. And of course, you have to take assumptions. And that's very difficult, because the historical development is rather that the reductions have been rather marginal so far, what we observed. But of course, to be in line with the EU's climate policies, these industrial emissions have to be reduced much more significant, and technology changes need to trigger this. So that's an element which is, I think, very difficult to consider. And I'm not sure if 1.6% per year for the future is the realistic assumption. I think if you decarbonize at 1.6% per year, you will not make it to be climate neutral by 2050. So I think more efforts are needed, and that's also to be considered for this assessment. But I admit it's a very difficult one when you want to extrapolate this. Well, that was in a nutshell some remarks on this paper. Maybe one very final one on the process. I mean, indeed, this assessment or obligation for the Commission to assess the export-related list already this year, that comes very early. And of course, that limits a bit the impact this assessment can have. I mean, the main implications can only be with the next review cycle of both the CBAM regulation and the ETS directive. So that's not for now, it's in 2 years or so from now. But of course, yeah, this assessment can be rather a kick-off of ongoing analysis, of ongoing discussions. And we will also set up a process which is not only leading to the carbon market report we will probably publish in October, but I think it will go beyond that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heiko. And again, I appreciate the critique of this. We take it as a critique from people that sometimes have much better information than we do. Clearly, we accept the fact that this is one element, that energy prices are playing an enormous cost, but a price of 60 to 80, at least in our mind, is gonna have to have some impact. It's on exports, but also some of the other things that you highlighted, clearly things that we will have to examine sometime. As Aaron said, we made assumptions because sometimes they were not easy assumptions, but some assumptions need to be made if you wanted to make a calculation, otherwise it just wouldn't fly. Adina and then Domin. Adina Georgescu, Eurometaux.
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes, hello everyone. I'm representing, the CBAM sectors called aluminium and ferroalloys. But I will be here also speaking on behalf of trying to cover everyone's concerns, not only the sectors that I am representing on a daily basis. Thank you, ERCST, for putting this report together. I think it's the right moment to start having this discussion, particularly in the context of the upcoming new policy cycle and political cycle, but obviously also in the context of the upcoming Commission report. And just a few points that I would like to make. A lot of things have already been said, particularly in the report, which is extremely very well researched and very thorough, and which is reflecting accurately the dire situation of the sectors. There are two aspects when it comes to carbon, if you wish, to the general carbon leakage loss, lack of competitiveness in Europe. So we have the general loss of EU competitiveness on a global level, which you pointed very correctly. It has been, is being driven by the high energy prices. It has been driven also by, additional regulatory costs, regulatory burden or framework that exists over here in Europe that is not well replicated elsewhere in the world. And then we have the carbon. If it's the carbon price, the carbon issue, I would like to refer here particularly on the risk that the carbon sectors, that the CBAM sectors will be facing, and that is the declining free allocation. And that, I don't know if it has been already, I don't think it has been sufficiently underlined. The risk, it means that in 10 years from now, in 2034, so that is 10 years, which actually in business terms, that means the day after tomorrow, we would have the CBAM sectors would have to be completely decarbonized, or they would, entail such a tremendous carbon cost that you have rightly calculated, and that would lead to loss of competitiveness. So it's not ambitious to say that this timeline is ambitious is an understatement. It is, if you are, and it's tremendously, if you wish, or even more, I would say, unrealistically ambitious, that in 10 years, whole sectors would be able to reach such level of decarbonization that will actually, help them at for this particular cost, would help them keep their competitiveness. So this is something that I think policymakers have to pay attention to, and for that, in designing the right export solution, they'll have to also look at the different types of technological solutions for the CBAM sectors. You have sectors where there is a possibility the technology for decarbonizing is there, provided that the level of investment is done and that the financial instruments are there. But there are other sectors such as aluminium, primary aluminium, where there's no available technology to deliver complete decarbonization yet. So that is an issue that has to be factored in designing an export solution. And as you listen, I am not questioning the fact that the European policymakers will not design an export solution. I think considering the change in the geopolitical situation around Europe at a global level, and also the existential threat of the overall European industry, I think it's a no-brainer that an export solution for CBAM sectors is needed, and it is needed now. It is needed actually yesterday, because investment in such technologies, they require time, and it is for the purpose of investment certainty, for investments in decarbonization, that it is needed to have an export solution that would encourage European companies to apply, to reach out, and to try to find to make this investment where they are possible, and then to also maintain some kind of foothold on the global markets. I will stop here, and perhaps later on we would circle back. I have a couple more points. Thank you.
We'll circle back as we enter into the discussion. Hopefully time allows as much as possible. Next is, as I mentioned, Domien van Genechten, E3G, Brussels-based, based in Brussels with a broader think tank.
Thanks, Andre. I'm actually Berlin-based these days.
Berlin, yes.
E3G is Brussels-based, well, London-based, Brussels-based, Berlin and Washington. So we're an international climate change think tank, and I work on mainly industrial transformation in Europe still. So first of all, thanks for the invitation, and congratulations on a very useful contribution to the debate. I think, as you rightly said in the beginning, like exports, or the treatment of exports under CBAM is a very contentious issue, will be a contentious issue, and is definitely still not well understood. So I think any contribution that is there to try to shed some light on the potential impacts of CBAM on exports, as well as laying bare how complicated this matter really is very useful. I think, and it's funny, like Heiko, you made a bunch of comments on some of the assumptions that I also had noted down. So I'm going to repeat a few of them, but I'll brush over this. But so I think, clearly, I think if we look at, if we try to assess the impacts of CBAM and the lack of an export solution in the next 5, 10, 15 years, like looking at the status quo, and especially like, past trends, is not, it's a good starting point, but I don't think it's a good a good basis necessarily for assessing the impacts, especially in an economy and for a bunch of industrial sectors that are transitioning very rapidly. I think, Heiko, you rightly mentioned that the 1.6% improvement rate per year is probably on the high end if you look at past performances. But if you look at the pipeline of projects that are in the making in Europe, that's a very low estimate, I think, of what is out there. To just give an example, and you also looked at the steel sector, I think Eurofair, the European Steel Association themselves, expect that the projects in the pipeline will decrease emissions by about 80 million tons by 2030, which is about 45% of current emissions in just 6-7 years. And I think your assessment had about 10% by 2030, which is not to say that, you know, this does not mean that there won't be any export or risk of export leakage, but it does hint towards the fact that, you know, things are very dynamic, things are changing very rapidly, and in that sense, we as E3G, and personally I always supported the Commission's, or not necessarily Commission's approach, but sort of the approach that landed in the political trialogues, which is a sort of wait, assess, and see approach, right? Like let's make this go for a few years. Let's do a bit more of a thorough analysis of the actual risks related to exports, and then let's reassess in a few years' time. I'm definitely a fan of that kind of approach rather than just a blunt approach where, you know, any sector that is part of CBAM will receive free allocation for their exports, because that risks another lock-in effect like we've had with free allocation in the first place, which was there to be a transitional instrument that's, you know, has been there now for, is it about 20 years and another 10 years, right? I think going forward, you know, obviously I don't have a crystal ball and I'm not sure what's going to happen in this new cycle, but I think it's clear that in the context of the current political dynamics, economic dynamics, and competitiveness concerns, that CBAM will be one of the things that will be looked at within the next Commission. And I think we need to tread very carefully. And if we go into a direction of export rebates, I think, you know, firstly, we need to sort of weigh the potential positive impacts, I guess, on avoiding export leakage to potential lock-in effects. I think as the paper also rightly points out, and I think, Michael, you mentioned that, is that the last few years we have seen a tremendous economic shock, high energy costs and other input costs that have impacted the competitiveness of energy-intensive industries. And all the while, we de facto had an export rebate in place, which was free allocation. And we've seen that that free allocation has done nothing to address those competitiveness issues. So, you know, first and foremost, the objective should be to help energy-intensive industries and industries in general get off their fossil fuel dependencies. And any potential export solution should be assessed against the risk of locking in continued fossil fuel consumption, I would say. I think a second point is that we have to be conscious about still like weaknesses of the current ETS design and how they might interplay with the potential export solution. I think specifically, and you mentioned, Andre, that this paper specifically is not trying to propose solutions, but a previous paper did do that. And you mentioned an export rebate on the basis of benchmarks. And I think, you know, as someone that has worked on the emissions trading system for a while, I still see a lot of flaws in the current benchmarking methods, especially considering how, you know, quickly some of these sectors are decarbonizing and how relatively slowly some of these benchmarks are adopted. So I think the moment we go into a conversation on export rebates, we need to, you know, consider the whole setup of the emissions trading system and everything that sort of like interlinks with that. And I think thirdly, that's more a political argument and something we haven't mentioned yet, is yes, WTO consistency is a matter that deserves attention. But I think, you know, what we've seen over the last few years already is that I don't think WTO consistency is the primary concern of EU member states. It's direct reactions and annoyances and potential risk of contributions from trade partners. And I think the EU broadly and member states specifically as well have really failed when it comes to CBAM diplomacy. I don't think CBAM has been solved internationally. I think we're still at the early phases of pushback. And doing an export rebate now without putting the necessary means and efforts into that necessary CBAM diplomacy is not going to, I don't think it's going to help the EU in the long term. You know, if we think about what some of the strengths of the European economy is, it is an open economy. It relies on inputs from abroad. It relies on export markets. So we need to tread very carefully if we go in this direction, and especially do lots more outreach and conversations and partnership building with you know, third economies that are very sensitive to the EU's move in this area. Yeah, I'll stop here. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Domine. And as I said, wait until you hit some really sensitive sectors like agriculture. Last two speakers, but not least, is Mark Poulain from AFEP, and then Claudia Gibbis from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Germany. So I'll go first with Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I will try to be as brief as possible. I was really struck by the good quality and the very interesting findings of the report. And I think that there are minor improvements to be made, but in essence, it's a very good capture of the situation and an assessment in terms of threat links to the absence of CBAM export mechanism as it stands. First of all, I think what is really useful with the report is all the factual analysis of the situation, starting with the worrisome situation of export market for the CBAM covered sector. I've not really seen that put forward as clearly as in the report, that actually, except maybe for aluminium, export in these sectors are rather declining. So I think we should first of all pay attention of this starting point, that a CBAM without a strong export mechanism can only worsen. And actually, I think the report is precisely giving some evidence of the situation. As Heiko Kunst mentioned, the linkage between export markets and the competitiveness of these sectors as such, and also their profitability, is also a key finding of the report. And I think we shouldn't really underestimate the point that actually it's not only that if we would have no CBAM export mechanism, that we could give up on some market share in foreign markets. It's basically in these sectors, if we give up this market share on export market, we can endanger the profitability of this sector. So I think it's really one of the key findings of the report, and that should really raise awareness about the importance of the issue of the export dimension of CBAM. And another point I noted and thought very important in the report is, of course, the global picture. That is really important to keep in mind, that we have these trade tendencies that are somehow inbuilt in the way CBAM will be implemented. Of course, there are these internal factors, but that are, of course, linked to the international situation, like energy prices. And that are partially based on let's say, foreign markets, but also the fact that electricity prices are not really likely to go on a reduction trend over the years because of the huge need of electricity to realize the green transition. So it's a key factor that we cannot escape, and that is a full picture of CBAM implementation, but we have this overall trade picture with overcapacities, and it's very useful that the report go through the situation of overcapacities with some specific sectors like steel and aluminium, where we know that it is a situation that has been monitored for years by notably the OECD, but there is no solution, and the situation is rather also worsening on this side. And maybe it's not really a criticism, but we need also to have some kind of forward-looking analysis towards the trade global picture. The situation may be even worse if, for instance, we have a Trump administration in place in the US, in the sense that on the top of this situation based on overcapacities, we may have new tariff in place, and with this situation, new trade diversions, and possibly an issue of, I would qualify it as a trade crunch. EU exports being potentially challenged on foreign markets with the CBAM premium. And on the top of it, new trade diversion flows due to new tariff, maybe in the US. And so on the import side, the EU would be also challenged. So it's not to have necessarily a very dramatic picture at the end, but I think the report has really put the key findings and analysis on how the CBAM with a CBAM premium that is very consistent with the figure that we calculated on AFEP side when we did the study. We came to the same range of CBAM prices. So we need to go for action. And certainly something which would be also at some point useful, maybe not for this report, but maybe the next report, is already to go for the economic calculation of what a CBAM rebate could produce, and to which extent the CBAM rebate could somehow reduce to a certain extent the CBAM premium. So it's a nutshell the conclusion I could draw from the draft report as it stands.
Thanks, Mark. Claudia, you are the last one in this round of discussion. Of course, we carry on after this. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss your findings, and also for the presentation of this remarkable and also very timely report. Much has already been said, and I hope I won't torture you if I repeat some of the arguments that have already been made. I try to avoid them as well as possible, but maybe some things become clearer if you look at them from a somewhat different perspectives as well. Yes, I think we all agree that the global market situation for the energy-intensive industry is rough and challenging. You describe it very well in your report, and we have said it already: global overcapacities, deteriorating trade relations, high energy costs, etc., plus the carbon costs in the EU. All these factors sum up and are a big challenge for the industry, and they have to be addressed and resolved as quick as possible. However, it has been said already, not all these factors are related to CBAM or to the carbon price. So we cannot expect CBAM to be a tool to solve all these trade related challenges. We have also heard about the difficulties associated with rebates from the carbon price to exporting companies, difficulties with the WTO law, and what is maybe even more important is concerns that exempting energy-intensive industries from the carbon price might jeopardize our climate targets. Also, any rebate on the carbon price would be equal to some sort of a subsidy. As Heiko mentioned, these allowances that have been handed out for free so far, they don't disappear, but they are reinvested as a subsidy. And when we talk about subsidies, we always have to make a decision: who do we want to export? Financial means are scarce, and so there is a competition for subsidies, and we have to make a decision: do we want to support exports generally, or do we more generally want to export, subsidize or support companies and sectors that produce low emission products? So that's a little bit a different discussion, the design of these subsidy schemes, but I think we have to make these decisions. Yeah, coming back to your report, the impact of CBAM on the exporting industries, you came to the conclusion that all sectors, but cement maybe, have a significant export share. I would like to better understand the relative importance of the exports compared to the imports. As Heiko pointed out, CBAM might lead to increased competitiveness on the domestic market, and maybe, or this is a question that could be analyzed in the future, could the loss on export markets be at least partly compensated by increased market shares within the EU? Maybe this could be analyzed also in the upcoming report by the Commission. I think that would be very interesting to look at. Also, your analysis in Chapter 4, the vulnerability assessment of selected goods. I think this is very interesting and very helpful. As you write, doing this exercise is quite complex and relies heavily on some assumptions. Although you said that the assumptions, they would not really change the picture. I would like to better understand how relevant are the carbon costs compared to the overall production cost or to the product price? And are EU producers really price takers, or can they allow some premium on the product price? I wonder if there is such thing as a unique world market price for carbon goods. Yeah, and in steel you had the 700 euro on average, but the German Environment Agency did an analysis some while ago where they looked at different CBAM products, and this analysis suggested that there's quite a significant variety of product prices. Yeah, you have, for example, the flat steel products. They're much more vulnerable than the long products, because of the different product prices there. So I think that would be interesting, to look at in more details. And I would also be interested to hear your views. Now I especially address the industry present, if that could be an issue where you could also help with data from your experience. And coming back to what I have said earlier, in the future we will see more and more low carbon industrial products produced in the EU. Hopefully already before 2034, when free allocation is fully phased out. But these low carbon products, they have low or at best no carbon cost. They would not benefit from deductions from the carbon price or from direct rebates. But they have higher production costs and compared to products with conventional fossil technologies. But the problem with exports of basic materials is not alone a problem related to the carbon price or to CBAM, but we have to look at it in a broader context. We have to make low emission products competitive on international markets. And I can say already that my ministry is working on a concept to create lead markets for green products, especially basic materials, which will be presented to the public in the next few weeks. And I think that could be a good starting point for us all to go on with this discussion. And last point, I fully support your request that the upcoming report by the Commission, it's crucial and will receive a lot of attention, and it should be carried out carefully and preferably with the participation of stakeholders. I also share your opinion that the export question is not only related to the CBAM goods, but also to the downstream goods, which are affected by the carbon price in the EU. They face higher costs for input materials and are often more important for EU value added than the basic materials. So it would be helpful, Heiko, if you could take the exporting downstream sectors into consideration too, when you look at the export question. And I think I leave it with that. thanks again for organizing this exchange of views, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Claudia. As I mentioned, this is not a perfect analysis. It is indicative, but not meant to be precise because there are assumptions. Some of the questions I think can be answered, and there's some analysis, a sensitivity analysis on price, if I remember correctly, showing some sensitivity whether the price was what the level of the price is. The price could be, in some cases, being seen as generous. It is come from a study. As they say, it's coming from a book. So it is coming from a study that is doing an average of a number of forecasts. Forecasts are what they are, and whether the price indeed is going to be 140, 150 in early 30s is something that we need to see. I will go first to my colleagues and see if there are any reaction. I think Aaron, there were a few reactions, especially on the side of some of the assumptions that was made. But Sarah and Michael, if you have also something that we want to react, happy to go around. I see a couple, hands up. I urge everybody to kind of intervene and make their points. This is a preview of, if you want the debate that we wanted to start early, because the commission analysis is going to start in the fall with probably, I would imagine, whenever the cycle for producing the report starts, the carbon function, the market function report. So we'll start to go to Aaron first.
Thanks, Andre. So I'll try to be quick because I want room or time for discussion, but just a couple of scattered thoughts in no particular order of relevance or importance. First, to talk about the assumption on GHG intensity of production. Of course, we did assume only a 1.4% improvement out to 2030 and then 2.5% after that. That may not sound like much, but to hammer home the point that I made about the sensitivity of the assumptions, if we instead assumed that by 2034, both of those sectors cut their emissions intensity in half, in 10 years from now, that would be a remarkable achievement. We would still have a premium over world prices in steel of 19% and in fertilizers of 24%. And in my view, that's probably still rules out your export markets. Just, I do understand that all of these things are assumptions, right? But just to point out that some of them don't matter that much to the bigger picture. But anyway, I did want to follow up with a couple of observations. I think that Heiko had one of the things you can do to reduce GHG intensity, of course, is to give money, subsidize these sectors to reduce their emissions intensity, adopt low carbon technologies in the same way that the US IRA is currently doing. Absolutely. So if half of the revenues from auctioning are going toward that kind of adoption, that changes the picture remarkably. But a couple of buts. One, we haven't seen yet that kind of coordinated, effective spending of money from the EU, and so it would be nice to see it. And two, that's fine, but in the long term, that's fine. Investment decisions made today can't depend on the possibility that a program like that may fund decarbonization investments in the needed capital in these sectors, and therefore, in the mid-transition over these very crucial next 10 years, it may not be enough to say, yes, you will be getting some money. Third, just to pick up on Dominguez's point about CBAM diplomacy, I think this is critical. If we are talking about the EU putting in place a policy for supporting exports in a way that will be controversial internationally, and it will, legally, politically, diplomatically, it will. There is definitely a need for the EU to step up its game in terms of the diplomacy around the world on this initiative. And one way to do that, I may sound like a broken record here, is to take some of the funds gained from CBAM revenues and spend them trying to soften the blow for exporters from other countries that are trying to comply with the requirements of CBAM. And then very finally, to pick up on the point that Claudia made, which I found extremely interesting, if we do find some sort of an export solution that pays back the cost of carbon to exporters, are we being disproportionately generous to high carbon exporters? I mean, low carbon exporters will not benefit from such a scheme to the same extent as high carbon exporters will. This is a serious design question, and one that we will obviously take up in our next report.
I think you made a new friend in Adina because she's smiling a lot. And you, Michael or Sarah, you guys want to add something? Before I go to Dan Molesky from Redshaw Advisors, I don't want to, I don't want to shortchange anybody because we all presented part of it, but I think most of it were directed to, as always, where the numbers show up. I think in some cases there was some stuff that also related to chapter 2, if you wanted, about the importance of export, but most of the questions or more the comments were addressed there, I think.
I'll save mine for the end. I think they're high level. So
okay, Dan, do you want to go first?
Yes. Firstly, amazing webinar once again. Everything the ERCST does is good as gold. Thank you very much. So my question is initially for Aaron, but anyone can pick it up. It's regarding the premium that CBAM could create on EU exports over global averages. And I appreciate, as Aaron, you mentioned, the assumptions you're making. They're not done on a general equilibrium model. They're more back of the napkin. Nonetheless, with the anticipation of jurisdictions such as China and India potentially looking at incorporating a robust cost carbon by 2030, 2034, would that potentially alter the global cost of exported goods? Since most likely they would pass through that cost, bake it into the steel or aluminum cost, mitigating the need for an EU CBAM rebate in the long term. I mean, in essence, the question is, if every most countries incorporate a cost of carbon, exports are going to get more expensive, right? Wouldn't that potentially, mitigate at least partially the need for an export rebate? Thank you very much.
Heiko, I think that you're nodding vigorously. Did you want to react to this?
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. Yes, of course, I think it would be logic that if there is carbon pricing in the countries where our exports go to, then they are at a level playing field, and those with the lower carbon footprint would have a competitive advantage, which would be rather our producers. So indeed, the introduction of carbon prices in other jurisdictions is the ultimate aim, and this would really solve also the export problem. But of course, it is something we can expect that it's happening overnight. But what we do see, and what I mentioned, what I pointed to, is the process is ongoing right now. But of course, we are not yet there.
Aaron, did you wanted to also react, but I wanted to go to Heiko first. Go ahead, please.
Just briefly, I mean, I support what Heiko just said. In the long run, we're seeing this accelerated trend toward adoption of carbon pricing. And of course, CBAM gets some of the credit for that. Many of these schemes were already in play and process in countries we're talking about, but those processes have accelerated since the imposition of CBAM. But, as Kane said, in the long run, we're all dead. If we look at it took 20 years to get the EU ETS to a point where we're starting to think about a meaningful carbon price, right? In some of the major competitor countries like China, we now have a carbon price which is provisionally applied to the electricity sector only, not even talking about industrial sectors, with a very low price. It's emissions intensity based as opposed to absolute emissions. It will take some time for these systems to ramp up to the point where we are ever going to see some relief from the differential in competitiveness between a meaningful carbon price like what's in the EU and what's faced in China, for example. So in the long run, it's great that we're seeing carbon pricing advancing in all these countries. But in the short term, if you look at what how meaningful carbon prices are in the 40 plus countries that have carbon prices, there are only a few countries that really stick out with a meaningful carbon price, and we can't expect that to change within the next 10 years.
Was it Mark?
That's not a very optimistic cost.
What was it, Mark Twain, who said that in the long term we're all dead? But anyway, hopefully we're not there yet. There are two people from industry that as Peter was first, Peter Wojcik, but also then Adolfo Aiello from Eurofair, because we used to use one of his sector, so to speak, as an example. Let's try and keep it short so we can go around and have a discussion. Go ahead, Peter, please.
Thank you, Andre. I hope you can hear me. I was trying to add to the debate, which is excellent, and I like the report very much. It's in my view very balanced, pointing out also the shortcomings and the urgent need for action. The chemical industry, just to point out my industry as an example, we are an export champion. We hold 16% of the world market in chemicals, and 1/3 of our production goes to outside Europe. So it is for us of dramatic importance that we hold our position there, and we contribute annually to the EU trade balance some 35 billion every year. So it's really not something where you can talk about overcapacity and suffering from imports. We are very import intensive and export intensive, and we expect the chemicals market of the world to double until 2030, roughly. So it is an enormous market. It's an enormous opportunity for European companies that we put at risk if we don't find a solution under CBAM for exports, and just without having that, expand the scope. And that is why we have said we have to cover that. We have to avoid that exposure. And on the other hand, we also have to think of the value chain, so as to avoid also bypassing that. So we also need to think about what do we do to processed goods that would also carry the carbon cost that are made in Europe. Do we lose that also in the outside world? That is really not contained in the current proposal nor in the current legislation. And we really are worried about that. Also, we are worried about the enforcement capabilities of the EU when we look at the first reporting round that was due early this year, where we understand some 5 to maximum 10% of importers provided information, not to speak about the value and the quality of that information. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let's go to Adolfo. Adolfo Aiello from Eurofair.
Yes, thank you. Eurofair, so is the European Steel Federation, for those that don't know it. Just very quickly, since steel was mentioned on several occasions, it's very, very important when you speak about steel to look at the overall picture. So on one side, indeed, we do have this big number of decarbonization projects, which should reduce emissions by 2030. By the way, of course, if we keep shrinking production in Europe, the percentage of abatement reduction looks always bigger and bigger. Domian was referring to more than 45%. This is because in 2023, we were at historically low production level. We never produced as little as in 2023. In normal times, that should have been roughly 30% emissions reductions, our 2030 projects. Few remarks on the upcoming Commission impact assessment. First of all, I heard there were comments about, doubts whether these sectors are price takers or not. Well, actually, already since the beginning of the EU ETS, we have been assessed against the risk of carbon leakage and our ability to pass on the cost without losing market shares. And in all assessments, steel, I think, has been always acknowledged as one of the top 3 most exposed sectors. So I would be very surprised if at some point, we are not assessed at risk of carbon leakage for exports. Secondly, very important to have discussions on assumptions, and everything can be questioned. I think it's also important to remark that the last Commission impact assessment was before the price spike of carbon. And we were assessed with the 40 euros carbon price assumption, I think, in the Commission assessment. So we hope now that, of course, this assessment will be done in the context of these new energy, but also carbon markets, that the impact assessment will take that into account. Another point about imports, true that imports will be subject to the CBAM, but one should always look at the overall import situation. We import around, depending on products, between 20 and 30%. What you showed on carbon intensities are global averages, but of course, there is worldwide, you can easily pick the 5 to 10% cleanest production, export to the EU, and continue that to the EU. So that would mean that the fact that CBAM will start on the import side does not guarantee EU importers to gain market shares on the European market. And by the way, that's not even the purpose of the CBAM. The CBAM is just to create a level playing field for environmental purposes, not for competitiveness purposes. So that's another point. And the last one is just to stress what I think Aaron has mentioned as well, is the time gap relevance of the export. We do agree that in the long term, you won't need an export solution. But as we know, we live on short, medium term, in particular for investment decisions which are also having impact on long term. And we know that the carbon leakage risk without an export solution will be very, very significant in the next years. Considering the carbon price, considering the pressure from international players, the mismatch in carbon costs in the next 10 years will remain very significant. Thanks.
Guys, I will ask you kindly to try and keep it in your intervention short, because we have panelists and then we cannot have everybody make intervention, or else we're not going to get anywhere. Any reactions for what you've heard? Again, I don't want this to become a one-way street. I would like to see more reaction and more diverse reactions if possible, especially that I have two more interveners that come from the same part of the world or the same side of the street. I'm looking for any reactions from anybody. If not, I'll go to Michael van Dessel and then to Bernard Lobar, but gentlemen, keep it short, please, so we can have a last round with from intervention from our panelists.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, everyone. Excellent discussion again. I'll try to keep it short indeed. I'll start with the bits I agree with previous speakers, is that CBAM should not be an overall competitiveness tool, but really be focused just on addressing carbon cost level playing field considerations. I also agree that historical trends have been dominated by probably energy costs and not, or the energy cost differential, not by carbon. But let's please not forget, we had free allowances in place to actually avoid that from happening. And so those have been effective in the past. And by the way, yes, we call them transitional, but they were always intended to be transitional, because at the time of the when the ETS was kind of introduced, the expectation was that the rest of the world would follow suit on more aggressive policies or a higher ambition as well, and that hasn't happened yet. So I don't think we should measure the transitional bit in a defined number of years, but in rather waiting for that expectation to materialize. So anyway, I think based on some of the comments that Claudia brought up, I'm always surprised to hear that there's concerns about an export solution would kind of result in lower ambitions. Let's not forget that the ETS remains in place for all EU producers, and so the cap is the cap, and so there's no, I mean, an export rebate or an export compensation is by no means a way out from ambition, right? And on the other hand, it is required for environmental effectiveness. If there's one thing that this study should be successful in pointing out, is that what is likely to happen to global emissions if you don't include an export component in the CBAM scope. And to Aaron's point, you don't necessarily need to do much more studying into how do you avoid that you kind of award poor performers and punish good performers. The Parliament's proposal, which was continue to use kind of a benchmark approach with free allowance or something else to put that reward at the level of the best performer, would avoid that from happening, right? So I think there are solutions there, and it's a question of political courage. Speaking as a company, right, with ExxonMobil, we have got $20 billion set aside between now and 27 globally to reduce emissions, both our own or helping others reduce theirs. And despite the high ambition in the EU, currently not much of that is kind of pointing towards Europe, because the challenge is really how do you make those investments investable, right? And we believe it's possible, right? We are supportive of CBAM, but without an export solution, it will be very, very difficult for global companies to make these investments investable. So looking forward to continue the debates on this very important matter. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you. And Bernard, last and then we'll come back to our panelists for closing reactions. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot for this presentation and the excellent workshop. Well, we are concerned. Well, maybe first, I'm working for Aegis Europe. I'm the chair of the CBAM task force, and I'm also working for the paper industry. Well, exports are key for most of the industry sectors. Many industry sectors cannot live without exports, and most of the developments, the growth is taking place outside Europe. We have drawn the attention of all stakeholders on this issue of export adjustment from the very beginning. And we have produced with some trade lawyers, some very famous, some very good trade lawyers, some analysis showing that export adjustment is possible, is WTO compatible. And with some people who used to work in the EU Commission, so they know what they are talking about also, because they were in Brussels and in Geneva. Innovation Fund, it's nice. There's money there. The only problem is to get access to it. I don't know anybody in my sector who is betting on innovation money, Innovation Fund money. Nobody. So it's nice, but honestly, it's probably not enough. We have heard some people talking about neighboring countries, Norway, UK, and so on. Well, the issue is also, and mainly with US, Turkey, China, and others. And if we expect these guys to go for some carbon pricing systems that are equivalent to the ones in Europe, I agree with Aaron, it will take a lot of time. And I will just finalize with this. It's nice to start with an impact assessment on the export, but it's a bit too early to take any conclusion. Last but not least, industry, we need a signal. If we want to invest now and do some achievement in terms of carbon reduction, we need to take decisions now. When you look at the context, you need at the situation today, energy price and so on. Well, and the lack of export adjustment, why shall we choose Europe? Honestly, we need a strong signal. It has to take place now. So I'm very happy about the debate here and also about the next commission and the next parliament, because we really need something to move in the right direction. Thank you.
All right. Look, I'll go back in reverse order if I can, because you've heard the commentaries, and a lot of it came from industry, not unexpectedly. A lot of it came from industry. I wish there were more diverse, but people either speak up. I cannot force anybody to speak up. Claudia, would you start first? Any concluding thoughts on what you heard? I don't know that there were. Hope the report was interesting. Probably the intervention was, probably what you had expected.
Yeah, thanks very much for this very, very interesting discussion also. I think we need a lot more of this kind of events to figure out what will be the next steps and how to best address all your concerns, because although I might have given the impression that I would not share your concerns about the export question for the industries. I really do, and I do think that we have to work very, very quickly on the question how to make especially the decarbonized, the low emission products competitive on a global scale. I also do hope that we will see some progress on the international level, yeah, with the Climate Club, also working on solutions towards standards for green products and also helping to make green products as default production technologies in the next couple of years, or maybe it might take longer, but I also encourage you as the industry to work cooperatively into this direction. And I'll leave it with that. Thanks again for this very interesting afternoon, and hand over back to you.
You're on mute, Andre.
Sorry about that. I was sneezing. I didn't want to blow people's eardrums away. Mark Glenn? But you need to unmute yourself too.
Really little to add, but yeah, indeed, maybe to clarify after speakers could share their view. The point is, of course, not to undo CBAM and undo the ETS and again the ETS revision. The point is to make it compatible with a sound export market for CBAM covered sector. And as Bernard Lombard pointed it out, there are ways to devise to engine a CBAM rebate which is WTO compatible, and I think there is still space to work on it, and precisely to use the impact assessment for the CBAM revision to be launched in the autumn to go towards this direction, and of course to do it in close coordination with trading partners and to find ways to somehow make our CBAM completely palatable to trading partners, and also including the possible export rebate. That would be my last quote.
Muted again, Andre.
Indeed, I still sneezing and such. I'm trying to, but then I forget myself. Domin, you go ahead. I think that would be interesting to hear what you take away from this.
Sure. I mean, it's not an easy thing to sum up, I would say, and I'm sure we'll be debating this for still a few years for sure. I think first and foremost, like I'm very much looking forward to this first Commission report on the actual or on the assessment of export leakage risks as a good basis, I think, for discussions in the next 5 years. And I think maybe to build on what Mark was saying, I mean, clearly this is something that is very important to industry and energy-intensive industries. And probably certain companies are potentially a lot more exposed than others. I can only hope that in their efforts of advocating for an export solution, they will also be advocating for the bigger boundary conditions that will need to be set in place for this to become politically acceptable internationally, so that they will also be advocating for additional capacity for the EU and member states to do CBAM diplomacy, maybe even advocate for CBAM revenues to flow towards international purposes. I think that would be very constructive. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Domin. Adina, and then Heiko.
Yes, thank you. Great discussion. Lots of good argument floating around. I would just like to close by reminding everyone, just mentioning again what is the scope of CBAM regulation, the CBAM in itself as an instrument, and that is to prevent the risk of carbon leakage, reducing global emissions, supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement, carbon leakage. It does not distinguish. I would just like, as a lawyer, I can't refrain myself from underlining that it does not distinguish between the types of products that would be at risk of carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is not debatable, but by the regulation, it is a reality, and it does not make difference between whether it should be low carbon, higher carbon products that would be exposed to carbon leakage. It is carbon leakage, no matter what type of product we consider in there. Then, in terms of reducing carbon emissions, we heard a lot today about that other countries are looking into setting up carbon pricing. I agree with Aaron that carbon pricing, it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not. I would just draw the attention to the fact that having a carbon pricing on paper in legislation does not deliver the scope of the CBAM regulation, and that would be reducing global carbon emission. So setting up a carbon pricing in a country is not sufficient unless it actually delivers the reduction of carbon emissions. And another question that the policymakers should be thinking at, what about those countries that are taking a different path from carbon pricing to achieve emission reduction? How would those measures be quantified? Because that would be, if you wish, you have a burden, you have a cost in Europe, but over there you have subsidies. So how does that match with the overall desire of preventing carbon leakage? This is something that I think by all means the policymakers and have to think of that when looking at the overall picture of the European industry, going beyond carbon leakage, but also looking into, because CBAM is part of the overall EU policy construction. It can't be seen separately from the overall discussions of ensuring European economy competitiveness. And it starts with CBAM sectors, but it continues with others. So let's not look at CBAM only from, through a small peephole. Let's look at it in a broader perspective of European policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina. Heiko, it's not quite the last word from the Commission, but always close to the last word.
Okay, well, many thanks. Well, there are a lot of interesting aspects and ideas I heard this afternoon, and I will take them back to the exercise we are now launching. But I would like to come back to 2 points which have been, I think, discussed by a number of interventions. And the first one is the time horizon for the introduction of carbon prices. Yes, it's true, so far this has been a very slow process, but we shouldn't underestimate the driver we have now. The driver for a jurisdiction to introduce carbon pricing is to be exempted from CBAM. So you have to be quick, and you have basically to make sure that you fulfill requirements of equivalence. And why should these third countries do it? Well, I think honestly, their main consideration is with CBAM, the revenues carbon price would go to the EU budget. If they introduce a meaningful carbon price themselves, it goes to their own government. And that makes a huge difference, and it is really a strong motivation to be quick and meaningful. My second point, the debate on export rebates. Well, I'm not a trade lawyer, so WTO compatibility, not much I would personally add to this discussion. Maybe just also one aspect that WTO compatibility might be a concern or not for energy-intensive industries in Europe. Fair enough. I think for a number of very important export-oriented sectors further downstream the value chain, I think they have a different perspective on this question. If we want to risk trade wars, yes or no? And I mean, what would be the implication of an export rebate? Well, we will have then less money available for the innovation fund and for state aid. State aid could be very tailored to address export issues. I mean, in the paper we see for the cement sectors, we have the problem actually in 2 or 3 member states. So state aid is a classical tool if you have a problem in 2 or 3 member states. No need maybe for a measure across 27 member states. And for the Innovation Fund, I think it is sometimes a tool which is a bit underrated in the debate, because it is so far, has a certain significance, but with the allowances we take from CBAM, from the fee location, and putting them into the Innovation Fund, it is really a lot. I mean, we talk about the current CBAM scope, it's 50% of the fee location. It's not marginal, it's really massive. And I think what we can offer in Europe is really legislative and regulatory certainty. We have the rules, the number of, you can calculate more or less the number of allowances which would go into the Innovation Fund in the next 10 years or 8 years. That's pretty much well known. Whereas if you look to the US for the RA, yes, it is a very impressive volume of the program, but it could happen that someone is elected in November and will just scrap this program and end of the story and end of any certainty for investments.
Thank you. Now let me turn to my colleagues to wrap up. Sarah, we'll go Sarah and then Aaron and then Michael, and I'll kind of then close with a few of my own remarks. But Sarah, you go first, please.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly respond to the comments about that the CBAM will lead to an increase in the share of European producers in the domestic market, which could of course be the case, but I just wanted to highlight again that those aren't necessarily replaceable with each other, and that especially some sectors are really relying on this export part because of the nature of their demand and the nature of their plants with these high fixed costs, and that the benefits that you would get on the domestic market may not necessarily come on the same timeline as the loss in these exports. And if you function with these lower capacity levels for a couple of years, you may already see that loss of those businesses. So yes, that was all from me.
Okay, Michael, Aaron.
In view of the little time we have left and in view of how much more thoughtful Michael always is in closing than I am, I'm going to give my time to him.
Do you gonna give him your time? Okay, go ahead. Then I'll take more. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks. Well, Aaron, I don't know about that, but of course it puts the pressure on me. First of all, as always, very detailed, very good feedback, and I'm, like my colleagues, grateful for all the helpful, critiques and points. My comments, as I kind of hinted at earlier, are not detailed ones, not on specifics, but rather on sort of bigger, high-level issues. And the first one I want to address is a comment made by a few of the panelists that relying on past trends and developments for the forward-looking assumptions may be too pessimistic, and reminding us, of course, that the decarbonization trajectory and the climate targets require tremendously accelerated decarbonization. Well, the first concern we have, and one of the arguments we try to put in, is, of course, that given the broader economic and policy parameters, and given some of the observed developments just in the last couple of years, we're concerned that unless there are changes to the policy framework, that decarbonization may only be achieved at the cost of partial deindustrialization. That's one. But the second thing is, I'm not necessarily sure that the backward-looking sort of basis of our assumptions is always going to be pessimistic. If we think of anything that's been hard to predict and uncertain or unforeseen in the last few years, many of those outlier events have been everything but helpful for decarbonization. Think of energy crisis, think of Ukraine, think of deteriorating geopolitics and fragmenting markets. So, You know, invasion of Taiwan would certainly not help us further prioritize decarbonization and assisting industry. We would switch focus very quickly. So our assumptions may be too pessimistic, maybe they're too optimistic. Hard to say when you're navigating in the realm of uncertainty. A second point that was made is that, you know, the CBAM and carbon pricing is not what has been driving the deteriorating parameters in economic context. And we say that in chapter 3. That really does look at everything but carbon pricing and CBAM. But again, you know, the CBAM and European policy are, unlike foreign wars or US election outcomes or global economic fragmentation, those are the things that we can control, that we have influence over. I also agree that CBAM diplomacy is extremely important, but let's not forget that precisely that driver of foreign carbon pricing development that Heiko repeatedly mentioned, and I think Claudia also, is due to the bite of the CBAM, not the friendliness. We've had more than 10 years of very helpful, very supportive carbon pricing outreach by the EU, by the World Bank and others, and they've not done very little to kind of really get that acceleration that we're seeing now. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Final point on the WTO, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more in the next paper. Very smart people have said that this could be an WTO illegal thing to try to think about an export-related solution. Smart people, including a former chair of the WTO appellate body, has said that the current CBAM, as it currently stands, is WTO illegal. And other smart people have proposed, you know, export solutions that they claim are perfectly WTO aligned. You know, and finally, whether they're smart or not, I cannot say, but I live in a country where people say the WTO should not determine our policy choices on these kinds of important issues. So a lot of different opinions out there. I think whether we like it or not, all trade-related climate measures are unfolding in a very fluid, trade law uncertain terrain. And to the extent that we have any hope of remaining relevant, or the WTO has hope of remaining relevant, the debates within and around the WTO will have to reflect that. And I think we can see evolution already. So 3 sort of high-level points from my side. Back to Andre.
Well, look, you know, who said it? Yogi Berra says it's difficult to make prediction, especially about the future. So who knows what the future is going to bring? But the couple of things. One of them is why are we gathered here? We're gathered here because we wanted to, I'm not going to go into that direction, but we gather here because we are in the process of we're waiting to see the commission start its own process of review. And we wanted to give some ideas or some views of how this process should be undertaken. We're not here to provide a solution whether WTO, non-WTO, compatible or not compatible. I think the purpose of this exercise, of what it did today, was this is an important topic. It has some urgency behind it. And that we urge to the degree possible that the commission can and wants is to provide some kind of a special process. Because there's a second question, and the second question would be from my side, what is the outcome of this review gonna have to indicate in order to trigger a proposal? I mean, if I am making a prediction about the future, I say it's difficult to make this prediction, but I'm trying to imagine what would this report say that would then say, oops, now I have to make a proposal because this is what the report says. And that's what I think is an important thing. We need to understand what is that outcome. So these are 2 things that I think are important to understand, is the fact that we are not in the solution discussion now. It is, where we're just trying to say, please process, this is an important way how you do this. We have, in the end, the information. There is more information than we have had in the future. The review of carbon leakage and proving carbon leakage has always been a difficult one. It is a very difficult one to prove carbon leakage, to prove intent. We know that. This has always been the case, and to differentiate of the impact of different reason for making decisions is also a very, if not impossible, reason. Unless you can have data, but in the end, unless you also get in the senior management committee of a board and figure out why decisions are made, it's always also very difficult to tell. So these are, I think, some of the things that we take away, WTO compatible or not. I think it's something that, as Michael said, for a long time, we had thought that this CBAM, which was in the past, a CBAM solution would not be a compatible WTO, where now we tend to look at things in a different way. So let's see what the Commission comes up and proposes to us, and we are a loyal stakeholder that we are here to help and to provide our input together with our colleagues. Some of you have a book, we don't have a book, so it makes it a little bit easier for us to be more neutral than others. But again, Heiko and Claudia and Adina and Mark and Domin, all of you, thank you very, very much for taking the time, and those that have intervened, and always a pleasure to work with my colleagues, and we will see you at the next report because there are a few more coming up. So thank you all very much for this afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.